Hi, my name is Sean Olson. This is the third video in the Hammered to the Max series. In the first two videos we covered the basic UI of 3ds Max and basic concepts in materials and objects and textures. In this video we're going to cover the basics of Wallworm itself. Wallworm is a complete pipeline for the source engine. It allows you to create models, materials, textures, levels, and other files for the source engine and allows you to send your assets and levels directly into the game engine. There's already documentation and good video on installing Wallworm, so I'm going to skip that. We're going to go over the basic structure of how Wallworm functions are organized and how to get to most basic functions. Once Wallworm is installed, you'll see in the main menus in Max a menu item named Wallworm. If you click this, you're going to see a bunch of submenus, and these are categories for types of tasks you might do in Wallworm. The first one is Wallworm Model Tools, and this contains most of the main tools for working with models for sending into the source engine. And this is where a lot of people that have been using Wallworm over the years focus most of their efforts and attentions. So you use this menu and this drop-down menu that comes here for functions to make your models, to make props. Your next one here, you'll see that the list is significantly longer, and there are even menus with further submenus, is for level design. So this is for working with your levels and creating maps to send into the game. The third column is for materials. This is to create different types of materials for sending into source. It's also for importing materials from the game engine into 3ds Max. In the utilities rollout, you're going to find various functions that deal with miscellaneous utilities. For example, checking for updates for Wallworm, or you can check for problems here with the problem checker to test whether or not your scene has invalid geometry and that kind of thing. And there's other different miscellaneous tools down here. The Importers menu will allow you to bring props from your game into 3ds Max. The Exporters menu is the generic menu for exporting the different assets. For example, your level and the models, etc. The Extras menu has just a bunch of different utilities and functions that are not necessarily specific to Wallworm or Source Engine and can be used for various tasks inside 3ds Max. The Wallworm Online menu has a bunch of links to different pages on the internet for documentation, help, etc., including the changelog, an ebook called Hammered to the Max, etc. The Wallworm Pro link here will bring up the button to activate Wallworm Pro if you own a license to Wallworm Pro, or take you to a page to buy it. The Wallworm Settings is where you set most of the global settings for Wallworm, and again there's Wallworm Help that brings up a menu for help. Some of the items are in multiple rollouts, some of the items are in multiple menus. For example, Wallworm Help is also located under the Wallworm Online menu. If you click the Wallworm Help, you'll see a menu where you can click different links to get feedback, including on the Wallworm forums, the Discord channel, Facebook, Google+, send an email, or check for updates. And also check for problems. So when you first come to Wallworm, one of the things you need to make sure to do in order to take advantage of all of the features is to make sure that 3ds Max and Wallworm are configured for the game engine you're working on. You can always do that by going to the settings. I'm going to open up these. So there are a bunch of settings that control how Wallworm works. And the main ones that are very important to get your pipeline to work seamlessly, to avoid problems of missing textures, etc., is to make sure you have these settings set up correctly. You have to set up these different paths for the game and asset paths and different compilers, as well as an FGD. Now, the easiest way to do that is to import your game config from your game. So you can see here I've imported the settings for a bunch of different games that I can work with, and I can swap between these. If I click on any one of these and hit load settings, for example, if I click the CSGO one here and load it, you're going to see that all of these paths are going to change and have different settings. So you can save different paths, different settings for different games. This is very similar to if we want to work in Hammer and we go to the options, you're going to see that there is game configurations. And a bunch of these are actually the same type of things that you would have seen in the Wallworm settings. The build programs would be where VBSP, VViz, and VRAD are. And the game configurations are where the output files go to. It's the exact same things. In fact, let's move this over here and bring up my options again. And just to compare these, I'm going to bring back my Black Mesa settings here. So once I loaded this up, you're going to see that this FGD path right here is the same as the game data file for my Black Mesa setup here. You're going to see that the game directory here is the same as my game info directory. That's the game directory. The map source here, I have it at set of different paths, but that's where the saved maps go to. And let's go to the build programs over here. You can see that this is the BSP executable, same here. So that's where all of these settings, this is what they relate to. So if you're confused about getting Wallworm set up to your game and you're not sure how to use the import game config, you can always open up Hammer and look at the settings it has, and you should be able to figure things out that way. That being said, the easiest way to configure your game for Wallworm is to click this Import Game Config button. And when you do that, go to your game, go to the bin folder, and look for a game config file and hit open. That will be what imports the settings for your game and preset all the paths without you having to do it manually. So one thing to be aware of is that many of the functions and many of the buttons in the UI in Max have tooltips. So if you look at it and it doesn't have, if you're not really sure what it means, a lot of times you can hover over it and you'll see a tooltip pop up. You'll see a tooltip pop up. And you can see here, it'll tell you kind of what that setting might do. Also, many of the things have links. So if you see a blue link in the UI like this, that means if you click it, it will open up a web page. It opened up on my other screen here that tells you some information about that group of settings. Not everything has documentation, but most of it does. So the first thing you should get in the habit of is at least hovering over a button just to see what the tooltip is, just to see if there's extra information that helps you understand what that setting might affect. And it's not just settings, it's most of the UI of most functions in Wallworm in general have helpful tooltips to help you understand what the setting does. So in these global settings, the main tab here, Paths, affects compiling assets and saving assets and interacting with the game and getting the assets. The other tabs affect different components of Wallworm globally. So any setting that you do in these tabs affect your entire setup for Wallworm. For example, in the model exporter settings group here, we have the exporter plugin used across Wallworm. It should by default, if you have the free version, be set to Wallworm SMD exporter. If you have Wallworm Pro, you should be using the Wallworm Pro. And if you have very old versions of Max, you can still choose to use these legacy exporters. But I recommend using either the Wallworm or Wallworm Pro with more preference for Wallworm Pro. The reason being is that many of these settings that are in here are only used in these exporters. So for example, if I turn on this option full material name, these two other exporters don't even know how to interpret that setting. And again, they have tooltips. So for example, you see here, use hitbox rotations. What does it mean and what's it for? Well, you can see here it says write hitbox rotations into QC in CSGO. Older mods may not support this. So basically, we turn this on if your mod or game supports this thing. You turn it off for games that don't support it. And that's really the kind of thing that you'll find these global settings will affect. Now down here are two big menus, list boxes of paths. And it's kind of important to understand what these do. These are default paths for the materials and models when you're using what's called wallworm model tools. So when you're making a new prop, whatever path is set here in the model path will be the default path for wherever your new models are going to go to. So to demonstrate that, we'll create a new path here, and this would be the output path for my models for this project. So if I was working on a project or a map or a type of group of assets that I wanted to call props examples, and among those might be another folder, so I might have several groups of these. So I do prop examples rocks. I can add that to my list, and if I wanted another folder, because I might be making several groups, several of these that might be part of these subgroups, I might do props examples foliage as another example. So now these are saved as presets that I can always choose, but whatever one is selected will be the one that will default. So I'm going to actually copy this and type a new one up here into the materials one, and do the same thing up here and add this, but I want to keep these on rocks because I'm going to make some rocks. And to show you how that affected this, so now we'll open up what is called the Wallworm Model Tools floater. And I have this over here for now. I'm going to put it over here. And what that means is, imagine I were to have made a rock prop, which for the moment we're just going to represent a rock with this box. And I'm going to hit pick model and pick it, and you can see that the path of this is going to be props examples / rock, and any materials exported for it will be under models props examples / rocks, because those were the defaults that I had selected. You can also see that any of the ones that are in these lists, the global list here, are still available in this list. So this is a way for you to quickly select the ones that you are commonly going back and forth from. Notice also, again, this group is called defaults for WWMT. Now, WWMT stands for Wallworm Model Tools. These are the defaults. So we have the default paths, which we just covered, but also there's a few others that we can set defaults for, including a mapping channel. See, we have mapping channel set to 0 here. Let's bring this over closer. And you can see that the channel is set to 0 over here. I also have the default set to static prop, and that is why this was set as a static prop to begin with. There's also some other options, for example, rotate origin, and also use local origin as world. The use local origin maps to this one. The rotate origin maps to this setting over here. And a couple other defaults that are not specific to Wallworm Model Tools, but are also they're relevant to the Wallworm Model Tool helpers, but they're also just relevant to the S&D exporters. And so those are explicit normals, the normal settings. You see I have it set to explicit normals, and that's why this defaults to explicit normals. And this setting down here, use global setting, which we can set individually, but it actually relates to this setting here, whether the full material name is on or off. So that's how some of these settings relate. I'm not explaining 100% what those settings are here. There are tooltips and more documentation on those, but the intent here is to show you how some of these relate to each other. So let's look at our box here, and you'll see in the screen when I had used this Wallworm Model Tool button here and picked it, it created this yellow helper in the scene, and it says WWMT:box01. WWMT again stands for Wallworm Model Tools. This object here is what we call the Wallworm Model Tool helper. It contains all the data for this prop. So anything you see in this UI here, in this big floater, all of this data is stored within this object. So later, if we come back to the scene and we want to make a change to one of the parameters, we come back. Let's show you this. We'll open up the Wallworm model tool floater and we'll hit pick model. And if we pick this, it's going to fill this in with the details that we had already set in this floater. So they're stored in there. So let's talk about the name of this model and dealing with this prop. So one of the main reasons people come in to use Wallworm is to get their props into the game. So you'll notice that by default our model was named Box001. And the reason it started that way is because the object itself, so if I select this object, you'll notice that its name was Box001. So it derives its name from the object. If I change the name of this object to Rock01, the model is still not named differently because the name of the model, what it's going to be going into the game as, is based off of this field right here. So in this case, I would name it Rock01 if I wanted to. And now if I want to send this into the game, I can do that by clicking this Export QC and Model, and we'll have this Rock. So notice that as soon as I tabbed off a model name, the viewport updated to show that this is named Rock01 now. So this lets you know the name of the model. Also, that you'll notice some differences in the naming of this. If I hit this lock button, you're going to see an L right here. That L means that this object is locked, and any exports of this, the QC will not overwrite the QC. The QC is the file that describes this model for the compiler to send into the game. So that's what that L means if you ever see that. So now all we need to do to get this in the game here is to hit Export QC and Model. So if I click this, it brought it up over here in the other screen, Half-Life Model Viewer with my prop in the game. And notice that there's no materials on it. And that is because by default, the material that I used on here doesn't exist in the game because I chose to use the path models, props, examples, rocks as my material path. And the material that's on here, there's nothing in that path. That path doesn't even exist yet. And I can tell that by clicking this VMT dir button. If I click this, it's going to open up, it's going to create that folder if it doesn't exist, and then show you what's in it in Windows Explorer. And you can see here there's nothing in this folder. There's no material there. And if we go to Half-Life Model Viewer, you'll see that it lists that it tried to load a material that doesn't exist. To get your material into the game from this floater, you just hit this Export VTFs button. And it would list any materials or textures that it needs to export. In this case, there's just a material on this object. It doesn't have any textures. So I'm just going to hit Export Selected Textures. Tells me that. Now if I go over into Half-Life Model Viewer and hit Refresh or F5, you're going to see that there's our material. Now this doesn't really look like a rock now. So, once you have this prop and you want to start editing it and turning it into a prop you want to send into the game, you can use all of the different modifiers that you could use inside Max to do whatever you want to do. So I'm going to just real briefly kind of turn this into a different rock-like model and re-export it. When you hit F4, it shows the edges on your model. So I want to add a few more vertices here, a few more edges to add a little bit of extra topology on this. And then I want to I'm going to use a modifier called Spherify. So I'm going to make this more round. I'm going to relax this a little bit. And then I want to smooth everything down. So I'm just going to add a smooth modifier. And I'm going to put everything on smoothing group 1, so now everything's smooth. So if I toggle on or off my edge faces, you can see the smooth. So I'm going to disable the smooth modifier real fast so you can see the differences. The reason that it looks so much different is on the box at the base, each side was among a different smoothing group, so they didn't smooth. And even though I added the sphere and relax to smooth them out more, at the borders between where the different smoothing groups, that's not smoothing with the normals. So this, what the smooth modifier did is it smoothed those out. So now I'm going to add another modifier on here. I'm going to call noise. So you can use all these different modifiers. So let's assume that this is our rock. And we could do all kinds of different things to really make this rock fantastic. But I'm not going to go into that right now. But since I made these changes, if I want this change to go into the game, I have to now hit Export QC and Model again. So what it's going to do is re-export it. And now in my model viewer, there's my rock. So let's talk about another thing, and that's that the export of the materials and the textures is always independent. So if I go in here, let's open up the material editor. I'm going to use the pick material button to pick this. So you see here that this material has no textures. It doesn't have a diffuse bitmap or anything, and that's why it's just using this flat solid color. If I double click on this material, I can go in here and change the color to, like, let's more of a grayish, darker gray color, right? So let's say that this is the color we want. Oop, I forgot to hit OK. So let's say that this is the color we want on this. Even though I change that, and even though I go right now and click export, it's still orange. The reason is, actually I can keep this open here. The reason is it didn't re-export the materials. So now what I want to do is go back here to export VTFs, check this checkbox because it was unchecked by default, because it sees that the file already existed and assumes you don't need to re-export it necessarily. So you click it and hit export selected. And now in my model viewer, if I hit refresh, you're going to see that the material updated. So any changes to the material require you to re-export the material. And if you happen to actually have changed the name of the material, so the path that it was going to, that would require you to both re-export the material and the model. So that's the basic introduction of making a prop, and there will be more videos that explain more of the advanced features. But we're going to move on now. Let's go to the Materials tab here. So some of these options up here affect the way the VMT, which is the material, will be generated. This Textures option right here, in large part only works if you have Wallworm Pro. In fact, if you see this little asterisk, if you see a little asterisk next to an option, you'll see that it tells you what those are here. Those are only used in Wallworm Pro. So some of these, in Wallworm Pro, you can choose the default VTF versions and bitmaps, etc. The material generator will affect the way materials are brought in from source, and affect the type of shaders used for displaying. And the light mapped 4-way blend and the DX shader Black Mesa should pretty much always be what you have set in here. The multi-blend, you should really never use that. In fact, it will probably be removed from the settings at some point. And for the displacement shaders, the only reason you would ever use these older versions is if you're using a very old version of 3ds Max that does not support the Black Mesa DirectX shader. This, by saying Black Mesa here, it's not saying it's for the game Black Mesa. It was a shader that we developed while making Black Mesa tools for 3ds Max. Also, some of these settings here, now this Black Mesa Seamless is related to the game Black Mesa, because the seamless scale logic is different in that game. But all of these settings affect the way either materials come into or are exported out of Max. The Skywriter section here are the defaults for new Skywriter nodes. These settings do not take effect until Max restarts. So that's an important thing. And these are just the default settings for Skywriter nodes, which we'll cover later. The Level Design tab controls a bunch of the settings that are based off of default settings for new levels. For example, the name of the sky for a level, the name of brush materials that don't have any materials. So any brushes that you haven't put a material on them will get this material here by default. Tools no draw, or whatever you happen to assign to it. We have the detail material, detail sprites, the VBSP file, those kind of things. The VMF exporter, these settings relate to how the exporter works and what parameters are exported. So if you're using an extremely old version of Source, you could probably turn off the include multi-blend and multi-blend colors. If you're, in fact, you can pretty much always have the second, the include multi-blend colors off. I'm not even really familiar with too many mods that are even using that at all. However, if you're using four-way blends, you need to turn this option on. So if this option is on, you will not get your four-way blends in your exported files. Some games allow multiple cordons, some don't. So that's depending on what kind of game you have. This displacement section will control the default behavior of brand new displacements and the default power of new displacements that you make. And this light map scale, this is the default scale for the light maps on the sides of brushes. So that's going to take us to the next topic, brushes and displacements. Because right now I'm sure some of you are scratching your head thinking, wait a minute, I thought this was just for models. No, you can make your entire level directly and entirely inside of 3ds Max. In fact, you can do everything for your level design directly in here without ever opening Hammer. So let's discuss some of this. In this scene right now, I have several objects. I have a text here that says wallworm.com, one that says hammered to the max, this item here that says WWMT rocks, and then this actual rock prop. So how and what are all of these things? In Wallworm, different types of objects are either handled automatically and natively, or you have to tag them. So in this scene, the only thing Wallworm knows about is this Wallworm model tool helper and its mesh. So it knows that this is a model, and the model that it represents is this mesh right here. Wallworm knows nothing about these two elements of text here. Nothing. So if I go to export this level into Source, and let's show you how that will go. We go to Wallworm, and we'll go to Level Design, and then I'll choose Export Scene as Game Level. This is the VMF exporter. This is what will export it into the game, and it will compile it just like the compilers from Hammer. I'm not going to compile this, but I am going to export it. So let's export this, and in this case, I'm going to call it Wallworm Example. If I go into Hammer, which I had open in my other screen, and I go to Open, I have this VMF file here. And if I open it, you're going to see the only thing it has here is that rock. If I double click it, you can see it's a prop static, and it's this rock 01. Nothing else got exported. Those text, nothing else. There's nothing else here. So how do we actually tell Wallworm that something is a brush, and what things are automatically known? And we'll discuss those things now. So for the moment, I'm going to close this and close this. I'm going to turn on snapping, 3D snaps, and I have snap to grid on. So I'm going to make some boxes. So this is kind of a traditional hammer method of making some layout here. We might make some ground here. This might be some ground, and this might be walls. And it just depends on how you have the layout for your level of what you're going to do here. And I'm just gonna leave it like this for the moment. So we have all these boxes here. These could be brushes. So had I made this in Hammer, everything you had made there automatically would be a brush. So let's go ahead and do our exporter again. Level design, export scene as game level, and export. I'm going to export it as the same thing. Hit yes. Let's go open our scene here. And there's nothing new. Those brushes are not there. And that's because they're not brushes yet. Again, Wallworm doesn't assume that anything generically is a brush, except for a few specific types of objects. So for those that are not understood as a brush, you have to tag them as a brush. So I'm going to select all. This will be easier if I display selected with edge faces. I'm going to select these all and tag them as a brush. If I hit Wallworm, level design, set selection as brush geometry, it should tag them as brushes. However, these are not brushes because they're have a bunch of coplanar polygons. So it didn't actually get tagged. So it's up to you to make sure that the objects you're tagging are valid. So for certain types of objects, like box objects, Wallworm will not let them be tagged. And it's not going to alert you to all of them when you go to tag them. So again, if I export this as a level here and open up Hammer, again, even though I had clicked tag those as brushes, Wallworm knew that those were invalid. It doesn't know that everything's invalid, but certain things it does. For example, a brush or a box primitive, this is a box primitive, you see, that has any length, height, or width segments that's above 1. So basically, I have to go in here and make this a valid brush. I'm right-clicking these spinners to send them all down to 1. That will now be a valid brush. If I right-click this, that's now a valid brush. I'm going to select all of these, and I'm just going to type in the Max Script Listener, these objects are now valid as brushes. And that means I can go to level design and hit set selection as brush geometry. Now that I do that, I can export this. And now if I go into view this scene, I'll do it inside of Hammer again, you can see that those objects are there. And I must have forgotten to select and tag a couple of these others here. We'll bring up a new function here. If I open up under Level Design Anvil, it brings up this floater that will allow me, if I go to the tag section, if I hit Select All World Geometry, you can see that it selected any of these that are tagged as world. And these were the ones that were missing. So I can select these two, and even from here, I can hit this Add button, and that will add those. Tag them as brush geometry. So I can tag them from Anvil tags, or I can tag them from this level design, or I can create a keyboard shortcut actually for set selection as brush geometry. So now that we export this again, I'll export this and we'll look at it in Hammer. And again, we don't need to use Hammer, but I'm just doing this to show you what you would get in Hammer. Oop. My screen is Let me bring up my camera here. I went way out of bounds there. All right. So notice that in Hammer, all of these have the tools no draw. But in Mechs, there's no material on them. So this again relates to, in the Wallworm settings under level design, the default material being tools no draw. Now, these are settings that are scene dependent. Okay, so these settings in here became what the default was when the scene started. But if I change this now to a different material, it will not affect what material is being exported into the level, because these default values are now saved within in the scene. So if we go to Anvil again, I have it open on the other screen. Let's go to the World tab. So the World tab has some of these settings now. So we saw that the default was Sky Day 01, but in this scene, it's now locked in as Sky Day 01. So even if my new default changes, this level will not change. And then if we go down here, the same with the detail sprites. Those were the defaults. And if we keep going down, you're going to see these are map parameters that affect the VMF exporter. So you can see here the cordon material for the scene, or the default material for those brushes that have no materials. So this here in the World tab of Anvil, again, let's show you how to get there. You click Wallworm, Level Design, Anvil. So Anvil is, you know, kind of a pun on hammer. A hammer is banged on an anvil. So that's how you come and you can go change these settings down here. Notice also there's two buttons at the top here, Show World Limits and Hide World Limits. If I zoom out, if I click the Show World Limits, you're going to see this big green helper out here. That is the extent of the designable area for source engine level. And if you're working in Gold Source, it would be significantly smaller. But this is the object that stores some of the settings for the level. So if I select that world limits, and if I go over here, you see nothing over here. That's because its rollout is actually contained over here. So in order for me to see it, if I have Anvil closed, I can actually see. It's the same settings. So basically some of these settings, like the material and the cordon material name and stuff, are actually stored within this object. So if I delete that, then those defaults will be reset back to or whatever your global settings are. So let's go back in here and talk about some other common tasks for making your level. So obviously we don't want no draw everywhere. These probably want to have some kind of textures on them. So let's assume I want these to be a texture from the game. We can bring in materials. So I'm going to hit materials, and I could just hit the VMT importer 2A. And it's going to ask me, do I want to apply this? I'm going to hit yes. So that's just going to apply that material to those objects. And if I select these walls around it, and let's put on some brick for it, so I can go to the importers, VMT importer, and let's go to brick. And unfortunately, the browser here doesn't preview them, so I have to know what they are, but we'll discuss some other methods here in a minute. And again, it asks me if I want to apply it. I'm going to hit yes. Now notice that the UV scales on these is horrendous by default. This is not what I want. So what I'm going to do actually is just select all of these and add a UVW map. I'm going to set it to box. I'm going to set the height, width, and length all, I believe, to 256. Oops. I switched the tile there. I think I want these to all be 256 by 256. Or And then I want to take this gizmo and move it up to the top of there to 128. So this is a little bit better and a little bit closer to what I would want. So the previous video discussed some of the UV stuff and a way of changing those around. I'm not going to go into the working with the UVs too much. We can make more docs and videos to really work with that kind of stuff down the road. We just imported one material at a time, and that can become inconvenient at times. So sometimes you want to have your whole set of materials. We're going to create a couple material libraries. And material libraries will allow us to see our materials and apply them more quickly than going one by one. So let's assume that I want a concrete and a brick material library. I'm going to click Wallworm, Materials, and choose the Material Library Generator. I just want brush materials. So I'm going to call this Brick Concrete. That's going to be the name of my material library. And I'm just going to use these folders, brick, concrete. So it's going to get all of the materials that are from those two folders and create a library from them called Brick Concrete. So let's do this and hit create. Now this may take a minute or two, and depending on whether you're using Wallworm Pro or not, it could take even longer. So it's going through and getting all the materials, even those from the VPK. So unlike previous videos that always said you had to extract them, there's no extraction going on here. It's all being done automatically. So let's let it finish up here. Notice some games or some materials are not supported in different versions. So Wallworm Pro will sometimes crash if you have an invalid material. That's a lot of times if it has a syntax error. So be conscious of that. So it says we created this under Brick Concrete Mat. So let me show you how to access this. To access this, I open up the material editor. I'm going to minimize all of these others. And I'm going to hit this little arrow right here and I hit Open Material Library. So by default, it should open up your material libraries folder. I'm going to sort by date created. So here's the last one created right here, Brick Concrete. So depending on how big your material library it is, the slower it will load. But I'm going to go ahead and double click this. So as you can see, it takes a minute to load up all of the little previews. I want to see bigger versions of these, so I'm going to right click. I'm going to right click the name of the library. And I'm going to hit Display Material Library As, and I want large icons. So it's going to go down and render out a thumbnail for each one of these in this library. The larger your material library, the longer it will take to create these thumbnails. But once it's created, we can just keep on zipping through. Now, when I made this library, I limited it to these two folders. You should almost never just hit asterisk and import your entire source engine library into a material library. It will be too big. It will use up too much RAM. So you should make specific smaller libraries. In this case, I made these two. I could have made one that was just brick and another one that was just concrete. I can further limit them by the names of the materials with their file names, but I didn't do that. And that's just something to be aware of. Do not make huge libraries, break it up into a few chunks. So in this case, because I have these now, I could say, oh, wait a minute. I want these walls to be this brick instead. So I'm going to assign it to the selection. And I didn't want it to be on all of those, so I'm going to hit undo. I'm going to deselect. It won't let me deselect because even a long-time user like me can sometimes forget I'm in sub-object selection. So I have 9 objects selected and I have the UVW's gizmo selected. So I need to get out of that sub-object selection to deselect my objects here. So I'm going to hit Q and I'm just going to pick a few of these walls. Let's say that these ones are going to use that material. So I can either click and drag out here onto them, and then it would be assigned to selection, and hit OK. And now those objects are using that material. So let's test this in Hammer and export again. And again, let's look at it in Hammer. And now you can see here's our textures. So we have a prop and a bunch of brushes. So this is getting you a little bit more familiar with using Max to get these different types of things into Hammer. So let's cover some other basic simple principles and concepts here. So we had tagged these brushes, these box primitives, as brushes. There are a few types of geometry you do not need to tag because Wallworm just knows what they are. I'm going to close the exporter here and show you those. So one of them is under the, we're going to go to the Geometry of the Create tab and change Standard Primitives to AEC Extended, and there's one here that says Wall. So this is one that if you make one of these, Wallworm automatically understands this as a brush. So it's going to assume that every time there's a wall in the scene, that is a brush. Let's open up the material editor again here, and let's put one of these, let's put this brick on here. Now you look and see that it's got really bad UVs. We're just going to go ahead, oh, I didn't mean to do that, hit Q here. I'm going to take the material that we used on, or the UV, I'm going to right click this UVW gizmo, copy this. So now this object is getting the same UVs and it has the brick that we just assigned to it. So now if we export this, you can see that those are exported as a brush. So that is a type of primitive that will automatically be determined as a brush, and it's with all versions of Max. And notice that when I select it in Hammer, it's all grouped together as one object, but it's several brushes that are just grouped together. Now one thing about this type of brush, let me ungroup this. You can see where the brush pieces are separated. So let's go back into Max and kind of like compare these two and show you how you can tell how that was going to be. So one thing you'll notice that this is one object in Max, and yet this object is not convex. It's composed of several convex elements, but it's not convex itself. It's concave. And how did this export as a brush? Well, Wallworm knows that certain types of objects should be exploded into their elements as individual brushes. So in this case, it took each element of it. So you can see, because I hit F4, let me toggle F4 so you can select and deselect. See, these lines here are showing you basically where the elements are at. Wallworm knew that this was a concave object, but is a brush, a collection of brushes, so it automatically exploded them. And certain geometry Wallworm will do that with, and others you have to tell it to do that. One of the things is we might wonder, like, how do we know, if we're just looking at an object, what would be individual pieces of it? There are different ways, but what I'm going to do right now is just add a polyselect modifier. And if I go to the element subobject mode, anywhere I click, all of the polygons that are highlighted, in fact, you'll see that some are hidden from our view, they're behind this piece. Those are each of the brushes. Each element of this becomes its own brush. And that's why when we go to Hammer, you can see like these little pieces, these little corners here, this one. If we go into Hammer, that's why that is its own brush when I ungrouped it. So Wallworm knows that a wall object is like that. But what if you wanted to make your own geometry and have the same effect? Because let's do this. We'll actually, right now this is a wall object. So its base object here is a wall. Okay? So one of the things about that, it's still parametric. It's still one object. In fact, I can go down here to the Vertex and change this by refining it. And I can say, okay, I want to add a new split right there, and I can go to these segments and do different things to it. So I can still edit it, but what if I decided I wanted to do something else, or even if I had made this manually and we want to see how to actually export this in a way. So we're going to actually convert this to an editable poly object. And now first we're going to just export it just as it is. Say you had done this on this wall. If I hit export scene as game level and export this into the game, let's reopen this. You're going to see that there's an invalid solid. And I'm going to set no, I don't want it to be deleted, but if I load it up, notice that that wall system is gone. And it's not here, and we had that invalid solid. The reason for that is this editable poly object that we collapsed to. So now you can see it's called the base object is editable poly, despite what the name says here. This editable poly, it tried to make one single brush out of this, and that's not going to work. So if you make a brush or a collection of brushes and combine them into one object like this, you have to tell Wallworm, hey, this is a collection of brushes. Each element is supposed to be a brush. So the way you do that is you select the object, you go to level design, and you hit set as concave brush. And this will tell the exporter to take the time to explode it at export time. So now when we export this again, even though it's not a wall object anymore, it's an editable poly. If we go and open up Hammer, now there's our wall. And again, because it was a concave brush, it's still a grouped object. There are other kinds of objects that Wallworm will automatically tag as brushes, and several of those are specific geometry plugins developed by Wallworm. Most of those are commercial ones, you have to get extra, but I'll show you how to get to these. If you own them and you go down to the Wallworm category, you'll see some of these. And those will include Corvex. So let's make a couple Corvex objects out here. And Corvex objects are similar to walls in certain circumstances and similar to just block brushes in others. So they're systems of brushes. So I'm going to take this one and tell it that this is going to be a wall Corvex. And these objects are driven by splines. So in this case, I'm going to create a wall that goes from here to here to here. And it's similar to a wall primitive that comes with Max, but actually it's far more advanced and has a lot more control. So I'm going to click that and then create another line here, and we'll just go to over here. So here's a wall Corvex object, and because it's driven by these splines, it means that if I select any of these splines, I can edit the walls and the corresponding pieces will update, so each element here will adapt to it. If I get out of this vertex mode and select it, I can go and change the width of all of these walls all at once. I can change the height of them all at once. I can say that let's control the UVs across the system in here and the materials. So I'm going to actually pick a material. I'm going to pick this brick material over here for it. And I might say that, oh, I don't want that material on the whole thing, maybe on the tops and bottoms. I want to use this material here. So now I picked it from an object in the scene, and now it applied that material to the wall. And I had accidentally set the bottom one to the same thing earlier. If I wanted to change the bottom one to a different one, I could just click this little button over here and pick another object in the scene, or the face that I currently have. Or I can, instead of, I can just change the IDs. So I can control all of these based off of the controls on here, including the UVs and all of that. I'm not going to go into all of the specifics about how to use Corvex objects, other than generally speaking, if you really get into level design in Max, I recommend making 95% of your brushes with Corvex. So this is a Corvex that's in wall mode. So let's discuss the other type of Corvex setting, and that's in block mode. So I have this other Corvex over here. It's not in wall mode. Every spline that it is controlled by will create an individual block. So let's go here and create a spline. And as soon as I start creating the spline, it will start making blocks. So I'm going to go in here and seal up these pieces. And you can see that I'm not having to carve up my scene like you might be in Hammer. I'm just setting these blocks at the locations where I want them to be cut up at. So this means that I can do all kinds of different layouts that might be take a lot of time to cut them up in a more traditional hammer-like method. So the main thing with this kind of mode of object is you have to make sure that from the top view, each element is convex, and then they will still remain as valid brushes. So just do a little bit here, and we'll end this, creating this little element here. So this is a Corvex set of objects that will become a bunch of brushes. Each of these elements will. Now if I go down to the materials section down here and pick my material over here, you can see that it has a certain setting for the scale of these. And I can go in here if I wanted to. There's a bunch of UV controls on here. Right now it's set to, the whole thing will tile based off of the height of this object. So if I don't like that, if I don't want to match the height, I click here and I can type in a specific value. Let's say 256. If that's the number I wanted. For some reason my keyboard is not letting me type a value right now. So I'm just going to spin this up to show you. So you can see that it's now tiling at that value. And there's different methods for how the UVs flow along the sides of blocks that is different than the ones that flow on these wall modes. But the next thing I was going to show you is, because I already have this wall, and I can say, you know what, I want to make a wall all the way along the outside border of this. So again, I can just select the same Corvex I already have, and I'm going to actually create a new spline. And this time I'm going to get off Snap to Grid and just choose Snap to Vertex. I'm going to just click along here and make these walls along the outside of this object that I did over here. And this is really just to show you how quickly and efficiently you can make fairly complex brush layouts in a fairly quick amount of time. Because I know a lot of people in Source Engine land do not understand how efficient you can be in 3ds Max, because they don't understand a lot of the tools that are available. So again, now because I have these as part of the same Corvex, they're two different splines but one Corvex object. Again, because they're all part of the same system, I can change all of their heights at once if I need to, or their widths. I can make sure that every vertex automatically, even though I've been designing these on the grid, I can hit this checkbox here, and no matter what, every single vertex in this object is aligned to the 1x1 grid, no matter what I do. So it will not let me have them off the grid. So when I go to export them, everything will be on the grid. Same with this box mode one. I can turn its snap to grid precision on, and those objects are now automatically on the grid. So before I export this, I'm going to do another thing, is I want to make sure that my camera always matches. So when I come into Hammer, it's going to use the same camera. So I'm going to hit Control C inside of Max. It's going to create a camera, and that's, you'll notice that when I did that, it says physical camera up here instead of perspective. All right, so let's export this again. And now when we open our scene up here, you can see here's all of our brushes. And that Corvex object, all the pieces are grouped together, and this Corvex object, all the pieces together. So that covers two types of geometry that are automatically exported as brushes in Wallworm. So let's go to another one, the arch primitive. Let's turn on snap to grid again. Get on the perspective view. We're going to turn on snap to grid and vertex snapping off, and we're going to create an arch primitive. And this primitive so now that we have this here, we have this set of options for this bridge. So if I didn't want this, if I want to turn off these blocks here, these are all just different pieces of this type of primitive. And I'm just going to get the material for this object from this, and I'm going to set the sides. And there we go. So we have this, and then you can control it however you want, but this one will export also. And let's go to another type of geometry, and that's called Shelvex. And Shelvex is allows you to use other objects in the scene as templates for how the brushes might be. So in this case, I'm just going to make an object like this. I'm going to convert this to an editable poly, delete this center, and then I want to chamfer off these corners like this. And let's do the same thing at these outer corners. So this plane here is now the template for the Shelvex object that I'm about to make, and it will by default start with the material that you apply to it. So I'm going to pick this object's material in my scene, and I'm going to put that on here like that. So now once I have this selected, I could create a Shelvex object from this Wallworm section here, and we'll just add one to the scene. And by default, when you add one, it's a cube. Now I have to hit it, pick source, and now it's got the source here. So now I'm going to hide the thing there, and you can see that this is now a bunch of brushes that's based off of that underlying geometry. So if I go back to that underlying geometry and I take an edge on it, let's take an edge right here, and we'll shift drag it out. Now of course the UVs are messed up right now, so we're going to have to fix that, but you can see that the Shelvex object is following along with it. In fact, if I go back to the Shelvex object, I can say I want it, instead of 8 units, let's go 64 units. And now it's 64 units deep. And it's based off of that geometry. So let's go back to our plane, get out of polygon mode, and add a UV modifier to it so we can get some better mapping on it. And let's do 512 by 512. And there you go. So now this shell vex object. So let's export this. Open the scene up again. And you can see that there's our brushes of that. Now remember, because this is parametric from another object, if I change the underlying geometry, it will update all these brushes all at once. Just like the Corvex objects updating the splines will update all of them at once. So this has covered a lot of the basics on brushes, making brushes, and some of the automatic brush tools inside of Wallworm and such. Now we're going to talk about some entity work. So obviously for you to have a game, you need entities. And you have to be able to script them and do all of that. Well, guess what? You can do all of that directly inside of 3ds Max. Again, you don't need to use Hammer at all when working on your level. But we will continue to show this stuff and compare them. So how do we add an entity to the scene? Well, we have the level design menu to go back to, and you're going to see this little group here, brush entities and point entities. So we're going to go and cover these two to begin with. And first we'll open up the brush entity floater. I'm going to move this out of my view for now. Basically, it's just like in Hammer. It has a list of entities, and if you select one, it will give you some information about that entity. If I want to turn a box into an entity, I select it and hit tie to entity. And let's just make some random boxes here. And so we don't always need to even put a material on these, but you can. Sometimes you might want a tool texture on them. But I'm just going to make a box here. So that might be one entity, and we might find another one that you walk through over here and do something else and do these. So if this one needs to be trigger hurt. So when you walk through this section, for whatever reason you get hurt. As soon as I hit tie to entity, you'll notice that when I have this object selected over here in the Modify tab, I can see that there's a bunch of new settings over here. So we have all of these different parameters that you would normally see in the entity editor or the inside of Hammer when you're editing the entity. If you need to set any of these, you just set them in here. Flags, etc. And if you have any outputs available on this type, you can just add a new output and start editing it right with this rollout. Say that this is say that this will trigger a change level, tie that to the entity, and now we have this entity start disabled. You could say yes or no. We'll have this other one over here. Let's tie this to trigger multiple. Tie it to entity. So when you walk through it, it might do something. And let's go ahead and add an output to this. We'll add an output. Select the output. Choose on start touch. As soon as you start touching this, you will affect this box 1 and we'll add enable. So as soon as you go through here, it will enable our change level. So until you go through here, that's not enabled. And you can see our list of entity or outputs here. And if I needed to change any of those, I just add them there. So that's how you make brush entities. And if you want something to no longer be an entity, you can select it and hit move to world. I'm not going to cover using all of these other things other than key values here. If for some reason there's an entity, let's take this and tie this to an entity again. Say there's a need to add a key value to this object that's not in your FGD. You select your object and hit this key values button, and now there's going to be a key values rollout, and this allows you to add new key values. So now I have test new, and save it. So you have to hit new first, and then type in the values and hit save, and then now when you export this, it will have that key value. And if I want to delete it, I just select it and hit delete. So now let's go to point entities. So I'm going to keep the brush entity one up here and bring out the level design point entities. Now this rollout's a little bit bigger and has some more options. I'm going to hide that over that for the moment. So when dropping these down, you might want to turn on snap to face toggle and maybe turn off snap to grid. So if I want to put an info player start out here, I just select it from this list, and just wherever I click, you're going to see an info player start. And as soon as I right click, it will select it and add the materials onto it. Now, there is one thing: if you keep on clicking, you'll keep on adding new ones. So in this case, let's say we need to have a few different cube maps in here. Let's go to cube maps, hit place. If I click, I can then continue clicking and add the cube maps. And then when I'm done with the cube map creation, I right click, and now they're done. And then those will be all the cube maps in here. And if I select one of these, you can see here's all of our cube map parameters. Now by default, entity nodes in the scene in 3ds Max in later versions, all of these will be a geometry class called Wallworm MDL, Wallworm model. So it's deriving its data from the MDL data if the model has, if the entity has a model attached or derives the material from it. So you may actually see a bunch of parameters here that aren't really relevant in the MDL parameters, but you can ignore those. What matters is the entity properties down here. So let's add a few more point entities. So let's add a crowbar, because everybody needs a crowbar, shouldn't they? And maybe this guy has a collection of crowbars here. So let's go ahead and add a bunch of crowbars here. And here's his crowbar collection. Now by default, when you place a prop, it's going to be 8 units above the ground. If you want the point that you pick to be where you put them, then you click this option, Picked Point Origin. So now if I add some more here, these guys, wherever the origin point was at for this prop, is where will be right on the ground. So these ones over here are up above, but these ones over here are right on the ground. Now the origin of this prop is not actually right along the edge of it, so it's still hovering some. Now there is a quirk in Wallworm that sometimes props don't automatically show their material until after they're been selected and the Modify tab open. So if you see that issue, you can just select the prop, and as long as the Modify tab is open, it will gather its material. Another thing to note is that there's this checkbox here, Generate Target Name. So if this is on every time you add a new entity with this Place Entities button, the target name of the entity will get a new random name. So this is important to understand because you may not want a name on every prop for all kinds of reasons, for the optimization and making your levels work correctly. So be wary of using this unless you understand what this option is and what it's doing. You may want to turn it off when you're dropping your props. But it does allow other entities to reference them directly. So in this case, we may say that if the user walks into this trigger multiple, so let's add an output here, and we're going to say when end touch, I can pick this item here, and because it did have a name, we do have the entire name of it listed here. And then I can say, all right, kill that, or add output, or do whatever else we need. Note, if the object you click does not have a target name, so I'm going to get rid of this target name on this, and I add an output or edit one, so I'm going to select this, and I'm going to edit it and hit pick target, and I believe it was this one. Now it's actually just the class name. The target becomes the class name of the object you picked. So when you do this pick target, if the target you pick has a target name, it will use that. If it doesn't, it will fall back and use the class name. So in this case, it would kill all of those crowbars instead of that specific one. So that's how that works. So this is going to bring us to the next feature about entities that's important. And I'm not going to cover right now some of these other functions in here that are pretty useful, but we'll cover those another time. We're going to cover the entity manager in Wallworm. So I'm going to go to level design and go to entity manager. So when you pop this up, and this is a really neat feature inside of Wallworm, you're going to see a list of all the entities in the level, and you're going to see a bunch of tools that allow you to filter and select and edit them. So for example, if I only want to see environment cube maps, I can select that from this list and hit filter. So it will only list the cube maps. If I double click one, it will select that object in the scene. So in this case, it was that specific cube map. And if I hit Z, I will go to that object that's selected right there. So you see in one column the entity's class, and the other column you're going to see the name of that object, in the node name in the scene. And its target name, had it had any, would be in this list. So we did give some of those, I'm going to get rid of this filter. We did give some of the crowbars item target names, so you can see here's all their specific target names. We can also see any models that are part of any of the objects. So, and here's the list of models. So these filters allow you to sort and find things in your scene in a very intuitive way. Also, we can see if any of the objects have outputs. So we know this trigger multiple has one output, and this trigger multiple has one output, and none of these have outputs. This true or false on this column shows if that class of entity has outputs available to it. So the cube maps have none, but these crowbars and triggers and the change level do. If I double click the output column of one of these, it will bring up a little entity editor that has all the parameters of that entity, the same as we saw in the modify list, and a tab that includes the ability to add new outputs to it. So if I wanted to add a new output, I could do on change level and type a name. And unfortunately, this doesn't let us pick a target. So we'd have to type in our target in this field. And then once we do that, we can then get a list of inputs that match whatever target we type in there. So we can do on change level, kill if we wanted to, etc., etc. And again, so the outputs you can edit via this menu, or you can also edit when you select the object and go to the Modify tab. So that's how you edit that. So again, if you double click the icon, you'll select the object in the viewport. If you double click the outputs column, you'll be able to edit the outputs of that object. So these filters up here have a lot of way to find and limit what you're looking at. So right now it's set to show all classes. It's also set to show any type of entity. However, if I just want to see point entities, if I click that and hit filter, I suddenly see no brush entities. So let's go back to solid endpoint. These icons have meanings. All of the green circles are point entities, and the orange cubes are brush entities. And if it has an icon on the left, a little dark circle, that means it has available, it takes inputs. And if it has a red circle on the right, that entity has the ability to send outputs. If I want to just show solid entities, I click that and do this. Let's go back to show just point entities. So we have some other filters that deal with the outputs. If I only want to see entities that implement outputs, I can select that from this list, limit it, and now any of them that do not have outputs will not be listed. We have the same option for inputs, visibility, and start disabled. I'm going to choose these back to ignore those. We can also find all of the entities using anything with specific models or specific strings in the model name. So for example, it takes the model and its path into consideration. So if I type in the word crow here and hit filter, it will only show anything that has crow in the name of the model somewhere. So if I change this to edit, because we know that the one was an editor, it will show any type of asset and entity that uses editor in the path of its model name. Likewise, we can limit based off of the target name. So that would be this column. So if I type in the word crow, it will limit all of these again. However, if I put 003 in there, it will only show ones that have 003 in the name, in the target name. Filter out again. So this is a useful way for you to find and manage and get to all of the different entities in your scene. And some of them you can even change the parameters, like their fade distances and that kind of thing. And again, just to point out, this list here is a list of all of the entity classes that are used in the scene. One quirk of this entity manager is it does not live update this list. So if you add new objects to the scene, you're going to have to click this update list from scene nodes button, and then it will update the list. But now that we've added some entities here, let's again export our scene and see how these entities turned out inside of Hammer. So I'll bring in my level exporter again and export this scene. And now that we have some entities in here, and again, those have no draw on them because that's the default material for any brush that has no material applied to it. But here's our info, player start, his collection of crowbars, and our cube maps. So let's talk about a few more functions and features in here. So this should get you on your way to understanding how to make some entities. Of course, if you're making a level, we'll go back to our point entities again here, and everyone's going to need a light environment usually, so we'll click and place that in here somewhere. And you can see that this one is actually a native max light. It's a direct light. So if you select it, it has all the standard settings, but the entity settings are under entity properties. And here's where you set it. Now, the thing about lights and in fact all of the entities in Maxes. You don't use pitch, yaw, and roll. You can, but you don't really need to, because what's actually exported for those is the actual angle. So if I rotate this in this scene, whatever the rotation is in here will get exported, not the values right here. So if I want to set specific values, I can. If I type them in here and hit set, I'm going to go ahead and hit get right now. So it just filled out the pitch, yaw, roll, and the pitch value from this light's current angles in the scene. If, for example, I wanted to change the pitch to 90, I'll have to hit set, and then it will update this in the scene. But you don't really need to, because you can just rotate it in the viewport, with the standard rotation tools. Let's have this light entity pointing at some angle here, the light environment. And then again, you can add light, so these omni lights. So if we add an omni light, same thing. Of course, these guys don't really use angles, so the rotation doesn't mean anything. But again, when I selected, the entity properties control information about it, the light color, etc. in here. So I guess we should go and cover one more automatic type of geometry, and that's source model. If you click this and add one to the scene here, it will just add a model node, and it allows you to load a prop from your game's VPK. So I'm going to load Alex here, and you can see here she is. So the way, if there's no entity tied to this object, the exporter will export this as either a static prop or a prop dynamic, based on whether or not the prop was compiled with static prop or not. And those are the default settings. So if I just drop this in here, it will compile to the game as prop dynamic. If you want specific controls for this, then I could either select this object and go over here into the point entities. Actually, we can just go down here and find this wallworm connection menu, and I could type in prop dynamic and tie to entity. And now if I go down, you're going to actually find the specific, I tied it to AI. I meant to do prop dynamic. I must have had a misspelling. So I'm going to tie it to a prop dynamic. So now it will actually explicitly export as a prop dynamic. And here's one other thing to note. Any entity that has a world model value, for example, props do, you're going to see it's grayed out in this list of entity properties if the object that we're selecting is a Wallworm MDL node, because the model for this object is controlled by the field up here in the world model list, which you can get from this browser we just chose. So in this case, if we change the model from this list, say we wanted to use Barney instead, this is the model that will export into the game. It does list it here, but this is not where you change it. So again, some of these parameters are duplicated and not used in this UI because Wallworm will use parameters elsewhere. Again, the pitch, yaw, roll, and in this case, the model names. So it's something to be aware of if you ever get confused. If you open up the entity properties and say, hey, why can I not change this? Just scroll up and go to the MDL properties, and then you can change it. So now we're going to discuss a few more of the tools and utilities in this video. So we're going to discuss some of these under the level design near the bottom. The Wallworm map compile tools. You can load a leak file. You can load the PRT file to see portals in your scene. You can load the log files. You can get brush by ID with this down here. So we're going to generate a leak so we can load a leak file. So that's easy. We haven't sealed our level up, so let's go to the exporter here. And I had a minute ago inadvertently clicked this and recorded, and that's why this was already checked. But you can see there's this compile map on export. If I want to compile this straight from Max, all I do is check that option. And it's going to pop up here with a bunch of different things here. And there was a leak up here. So we had a leak. If you see here, there's a button that says leak. I can load that file into Max. Go to testing here. And just like in Hammer, you're going to see a red line, and we're selected here. That red line has a camera attached to it called Map Leak Line. And if you play the animation, if you scrub the timeline, the camera will fly along the current leak line. So sometimes the leak will be some really long, bizarre thing. And if you have a really complex scene, sometimes, I'm going to hide this. Sometimes seeing the camera move along it can help. In fact, I can change my current view to use that camera. So when I do that, I will be seeing the view of that camera as it flies along the leak. But this is such a small leak line that it doesn't really, it's hard to tell. But that's how you find leaks. And it's up to you to understand how to seal your level, because the principle of sealing your level is identical in Max and Hammer. You have to have brushes sealing the playable area and sealing all the entities off from the void. So I'm not going to explain the sealing of this. I'll probably do that in the next video when we actually make a level with art and finish in mind. So I'm not going to take the time to seal this, but you do need to learn that if you don't understand how BSP works and a level needing to be sealed. So I'm going to just talk about a couple more basic utilities to help optimize your design workflow that you don't have available when working in Hammer. So we're going to start with one that I don't think I've documented anywhere before with people. And we'll go to point entities to begin with, and we're going to make soundscapes. So we're going to make some soundscape entities. We're going to plop these around. And so let's assume we have a soundscape in here, another one over here, another one over here, one over by Barney, and we'll do one over here. So each one of these will have a soundscape. So a lot of them are default to nothing. So, but you want to type in a name, right? So the name of this might be oval section. And the name of this might be path.exterior. A lot of times you see them with dots in their names. And this one might be like path.entrance. And the next one might be path.bigroom. You can call them whatever you want, obviously. And let's find our other soundscape here. And Barney dot start, where Barney's at. And I think that's all of them. Oh, did we name this one already? Yeah, we did. So now that we have all of these soundscapes in here, we can optimize the process of making our soundscript file by clicking Wallworm, Level Design, Wallworm Mist Tools, Soundscaper. We click this, it's going to open up our scripts folder if it's found, and pre-fill a soundscape file name that says soundscapes underscore and then the name of the level we're working on. Of course, you can name this whatever you want, but since we've already exported this level, it's going to pre-fill that name there. And once I hit save, once you do that, it will open up in your text editor SoundScript file. And you can see that it has made a a section for all of our soundscapes, including some sample code of what you can do here. So here's the point of this: is if you have a very big level and you have a bunch of places that need soundscapes, you can drop them all in and add their names, and then once you're done putting them where you need them, you can then create this file from your scene without having to go search around and find them. So it's kind of a useful way to optimize your flow there. Also, another compile tool that you'll find useful is if your scene has models that you want to have certain kind of radiosity shadow parameters based off of their transparent textures, and or if you have materials that give off light through radiosity, you can automatically generate those from your scene also by clicking Wallworm, Level Design, Mist Tools, and Radworm, and that will go through and find all of the materials that glow, all the world materials that glow, and then models that need their texture settings for the shadows. And a couple more convenient tools. We have one under the same place, Mist Tools. There's the res file generator. And if you click this, it will allow you to create a res file based off of your scene. So it will go through and collect. In this case, I'm going to go through and make a res file here and generate res file, and we'll just go ahead and generate this, and you see that it generated a list of all the assets it found from the scene. Another convenient thing in that same menu is if you already have a res file, you can hit this zip from res, in which case it will actually zip up all of the assets, your compiled assets, including the BSP, etc., into a zip file based off of your res file. Now these options here for what kind of assets are generated in the res file maker are mapping to these list of things down here in the VMF exporter. It says pack assets into BSP. So instead of using the res file generator, which you might for some circumstances, other times you want to pack them into your scene. Well, in this case, you just check all of these check boxes when you go to compile. And once you check those and hit the export button, all of your assets will be packed into your BSP for you when you compile the level. So that's going to conclude this first or this third video on Hammered to the Max. We've covered a lot of ground here: making brushes, tagging brushes, the types of objects that are automatically known as brushes, which are Corvex, Shelvex, Arch, and Wall primitives. We've discussed making entities. We've briefly covered using entity outputs. We've done brush and point entities. And there's a lot more, but we're going to go in those more advanced features in the next video. So in the next video, we're going to cover using prop line along with Corvex. We're going to cover making displacements and editing and working with displacements, and some of the more fancier art tools that are available. My name is Sean Olson. You can learn more about me at my website, seanolson.net, and you can always get the latest version of all the Wallworm tools at wallworm.com. Thank you, and have a good day.